Moses asked Pharaoh to free the Israelites from slavery. It had been 400 years since the chosen people of God were under Egyptian judgment. But the Pharaoh of Egypt's heart was numb, so he refused Moses' request. The faith of the people of Abraham was feeble, but God was beside Moses and his brother Aaron, and they would be God's instruments to fulfill the promise that God had made to Abraham and his descendants. God commanded Moses to meet Pharaoh, who was navigating the Nile in his beautiful vessel, and to ask again for the freedom of the Hebrew people. After another Pharaoh's refusal, Moses stabbed the river with his rod. The Nile waters became red as blood. The fish died, and a foul odor took over its banks. The Nile waters became undrinkable. The striking scene that Moses performed was not enough to change Pharaoh's will, since his magicians and priests had shown that they were also capable of performing a similar feat. The Egyptian people had to drill wells to quench their thirst, and this was the first plague of Egypt. Pharaoh continued unabated, and through Moses and his brother, God caused innumerable frogs to emerge from the Nile and invade the cities. The Egyptian homes were overrun by the amphibians. Not even the palaces were safe, and frogs stormed even Pharaoh's bed. Pharaoh declared that he would free the people of Moses if he drew back the plague that was sweeping Egypt, and Moses made all the frogs perish. The frogs' bodies piled up in the streets, and the rot spread in the air. When the worst was over, Pharaoh decided not to free the chosen people, and God ordered Aaron, Moses' brother, to strike the earth. The soil dust became lice that would infest Egypt. The men and animals of Egypt suffered from the infestation of lice. The Pharaoh's wizards tried to reproduce such a feat of Aaron, but were ineffective, and thought that it could only be God's feat. But the Pharaoh refused to even listen to his advisors. Therefore Egypt endured another plague. Clouds of flies took over Pharaoh's kingdom, but the Hebrews' living places were spared by God from the incessant hassles caused by flies. The sovereign's obstinacy caused God to provoke a plague that would cause the death of Egyptian cattle. Oxen, horses, asses, and rams died by the thousands, but not even this could melt the heart of Pharaoh. The Egyptians and their animals began to suffer from scabies, and their bodies were overcome by blisters. Still, the Pharaoh refused to free the people of Moses. God's representative on earth said that a punishment would fall from heaven on Egypt as never before. An overwhelming rain of immense hail and lightning terrified Egypt, and many of those who did not take refuge ended up dead. The plague of the locusts was the 8th to strike Egypt. Locust clouds eviscerated everything that was in their path. The Pharaoh sensed that his stubbornness was destroying his kingdom, but his pride prevented him from changing his position. Egypt was then gripped by a black mist, and darkness took over the kingdom of the Pharaoh. For 3 days they lived in darkness. This was the second to last plague that devastated the tormentors of the people of Israel. But the greatest plague of all was yet to come. God told Moses that he would impose his last punishment on Egypt. At midnight, he would go through Egypt and take with him the lives of all the firstborn of Egypt. Not even the eldest sons of the high nobility of Egypt would be spared. The mourning of the fathers would reverberate throughout Egypt, but God's chosen people had escaped unpunished from such a slaughter. Moses commanded the people of Israel to sacrifice lambs or young goats in honor of God. With the sacrificial animal's blood, they were to mark the entrance to their homes. The Hebrews would roast and eat the flesh of the sacrifice, and thereby celebrate the Passover of the Lord. At midnight, God sent the angel of death to Egypt, who inspected all the houses, reaping the lives of all the firstborn. sparing only the dwellings of those who had left the mark of the sacrifice. Among those who died was Pharaoh's son and heir. Pharaoh's unrelenting will had been shattered, and he finally yielded to the requests of Moses, ordering him and his people to leave Egypt. Moses managed to impose the will of the Creator and would now conduct the nation of Israel to the Promised Land. The people of Israel had already endured 430 years of slavery in Egypt until the arrival of Moses. After imposing 10 terrible plagues against Egypt, Moses succeeded in getting Pharaoh to finally free the descendants of Abraham. Under the leadership of Moses and Aaron, hundreds of thousands of Hebrews grabbed all their possessions and started their march to the Promised Land. The large column of migrants headed through the desert to avoid the Egyptian armies. God warned Moses that Pharaoh's heart was filling with hate and resentment. Soon, he'd turn his fury against the people of Moses. Following God's commands, Moses guided his people to the shores of the Red Sea. The news that Pharaoh had organized an army of war chariots to pursue the Hebrews reached the migrants. Many fell into despair and thought that the option of surrendering would be met with clemency by the Pharaoh, returning alive to their masters. Some blamed Moses for bringing the people of Israel to such ruin. Moses calmed his people and assured that God was at their side, and that would be the last time they would see the Egyptians on their trail. The dusty cloud on the horizon indicated that the Pharaoh's army was approaching quickly, but God created a flame barrier to block the Egyptians' progress. Then, God spoke to Moses and told him exactly. Moses had opened the Red Sea, crossing it with his people towards freedom. For days, Moses and the Israelites walked through the desert. They became hungry and thirsty. They started to suffer, and some complained that it would be better to live under the Egyptians' whip than being plagued by hunger and thirst in the desert until their ultimate extinction. But God would not allow the chosen people to perish in the desert. A miraculous food dropped from heaven as a grace from God. It was manna. Moses hit a rock with his rod and water gushed out of it. To supply the need for meat, God guided flocks of quails to the Hebrews, and the needs of the people of Israel were satisfied. Moses guided his people to the Sinai region. There was a mountain from where Moses could communicate directly with God. Only Moses had permission to climb the mountain. Anyone else who dared to climb it would be killed immediately. On top of Mount Sinai, God revealed to Moses the code of conduct that should be followed by the Israelites. The Lord's directives would become known as the 10 Commandments. The following commandments were written in stone. 1. You shall have no other gods besides me. 2. You shall create no idol for yourself, no image of anything in heaven, on earth, or in the waters beneath the earth. 3. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord shall not leave unpunished those who take his name in vain. 4. Remember the day of Saturday to sanctify it. 5. Honor your father and mother, so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God gives you. 6. You shall not kill. 7. You shall not commit adultery. 8. You shall not steal. 9. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. 10. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his servants, nor his maidservants, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is his. These laws God renewed the covenant with the people of Abraham. Moses presented the 10 Commandments to the people and warned them of the serious consequences that would fall on those who failed to comply with them. The first was quite clear, mentioning that there is no God but the God of Israel, and that idolatry would be one of the most serious sins. Moses returned to Mount Sinai and stayed there for 40 days in communion with God. His people, who stayed at the foot of the mountain, began to despair. They feared that Moses would never return. Aaron, brother of Moses, and other priests worried about the future of the people and disrespected the commandments